Let's start off in 1900, an election year, a new century, and a new president. Except the president wasn't new, because it was William McKinley for his second term. But it wasn't McKinley for long, because he was
shot down, shot down.
And in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became president. 2 years into his presidency, the Wright brothers got a plane off the ground in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The first ball drop was in Times Square, New Year's Eve, 1908.
Not that type of phone. Happy New Year.
Although it was called the Unsinkable Ship, the Titanic sunk in 1912. But celebrations soon ceased with the start of the Great War in 1914. In 1917, U.S. soldiers joined the fight against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. These soldiers included the valiant American war hero, Sergeant Alvin York. The war was fought in trenches and featured new weapons, including machine guns, airplanes, poison gas, and tanks. But for those who survived the Great War, the next decade was very different from the last. In 1920, women were first granted the right to vote via the 19th Amendment.
Let women vote! 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 Votes for women!
The 1920s was a decade of enjoyment and fun for the American people. Styles changed, and they included the most iconic figure of the 20s, the flapper. Some accomplishments of the 1920s. The Appalachian Trail was started in 1921. The first Winter Olympics was held in 1924. The Hoover Dam was finished in 1925, and Amelia Earhart set out over the Atlantic, never to be seen again, in 1928.
On October 24, 1928, the stock market crashed, marking the beginning of the Great Depression.
By 1932, the unemployed had reached 12 million.
May I have some bread? I have a baby at home. You can have the rest.
In 1932, Americans voted Franklin Delano Roosevelt, cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, into office. He ran largely on his hopefulness for the American people, many of whom had lost everything in the Depression. FDR started the Civilian Conservation Corps to rehabilitate the economy. But amidst the worry that the Depression brought to American families, there was still some enjoyment, with the radio becoming a favorite pastime. In 1938, Orson Welles did a little too job on his broadcast, War of the Worlds, because it led to widespread panic.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
Meanwhile, in Europe, World War II began in 1939.
Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, causing America to enter World War II.
In an effort to free France from German control, the Allied forces invade Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Finally, Japan surrendered in September 1945, ending World War II.
The National Basketball Association, otherwise known as the NBA, was formed in 1946. In 1947, Jackie Robinson joins the Dodgers to become the first African-American player in the major leagues. The first color TV goes on sale in 1950.
In 1954, in a case known as Brown v. Board of Education, racial segregation in public schools was declared unconstitutional. Disneyland, the most magical place on earth, opened in 1955.
Gordon Gould invented the laser in 1957, leading to the internet's best cat videos. The first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, was launched in 1958. Alaska was admitted to the U.S. as the 49th state in 1959. Later that year, Hawaii joined the U.S. as the 50th state. Aloha.
JFK was elected in 1960, and the Beatles were formed that same year.
John Glenn became the first U.S. astronaut to orbit the Earth in 1962.
Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech in 1962. JFK was shot and killed in 1963.
The Packers won the first Super Bowl in 1967. Thurgood Marshall became the first African-American Supreme Court justice in the same year. America accomplished a feat with the moon landing in 1969. The first man to walk on the moon was Neil Armstrong, but hear me out. His name is Neil A. Flip that around, spells alien. Coincidence? I think not. The scandal of the Watergate Hotel in 1972 is the first and so far only scandal that has led to a U.S. president to resign from office.
Which Nixon did in 1974.
That fact and many more made for great puzzles that have been asked on Wheel of Fortune, which debuted 1 year later in 1975.
In 1978, the United States returned the Panama Canal to Panama because I guess that's something they could take.
The first recorded eruption of Mount St. Helens took place 2 years later in 1980, so I suppose you could say the 80s started off with a bang.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan, the first celebrity president, was elected, and he loved jelly beans, just like Madison. Oh, no, I don't.
One for me.
The 1980s were quite the decade for women. In 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. 2 years later, Sally Ride became the first American woman to be in space. One of the highlights of the 80s was certainly the wonderful music. So of course we can't leave out Live Aid. So many amazing bands performed throughout the course of the 16-hour show in 1985.
Although President Reagan delivered the famous Tear Down This Wall speech, pressuring Russian President Gorbachev to remove the barrier between West and East Germany, it was the work of President George H. Bush, who was sworn into office shortly after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, that is credited with unifying the two Germanys.
The largest art theft in U.S. history took place in 1990 at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, depriving Boston of many beautiful pieces that have yet to be found. The first optical telescope, the Hubble telescope, was launched in 1990.
Say cheese!
And to wrap everything up, I was born. She's got cute little toes. Don't touch my toes.
God bless America.